We are Mike and Jeannie, and we restore old houses. In 2021, we moved to South Carolina and bought a 120-year-old Victorian house. Follow along as we put the polish back on this Victorian masterpiece.
Today's program is sponsored by the generous support of our patrons. Your support helps to further our historic preservation efforts. For more information, visit patreon.com/1834 Restoration House. Welcome back to 1834 Restoration House.
Today we're back in the wood shop and we're continuing to build the early American blanket chest. This is going to be the first of probably two.
At least two, I hope.
At least two. And who knows, maybe if things go well, who knows, we might build more of these. Anyway, let's go take a look and see what we've done so far. This chest was based on an early American chest that was actually built by somebody a long time ago. And we've taken that design and just tweaked it a little bit. We added box joints here, and we had a whole series on how that worked together. And this chest is built of northern white pine, or eastern white pine. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but anyway, we got it in New York. This is cedar down here, so we have a cedar bottom, and it is grooved and inset into the sides, and so it floats a little bit so that it can move and shift as the humidity changes up and down. And let's take a look at the inside real quick. Down the side there, you can see that beautiful red aromatic cedar. I have to do that every time just because it smells so good. Our job for today is to try to build a lid for this thing. Now, there is no piece of lumber that you can buy anymore that's probably big enough to do this entire thing. Those days have passed a long time ago. But sometimes in old houses, you can find old lumber that was really wide, like 16-inch wide, 20-inch wide, because we used to have trees that actually were huge. But those kinds of trees are pretty much gone now. So what I'd like to do is make a lid that comes here and overhangs just a little bit. So from the back edge of the chest to the front is 16 inches. So to get an overhang, I'd like to probably put maybe a 1/2-inch overhang, which gets us 16.5 here. And then we'll measure this as 40.5. And if I have a 1/2-inch overhang on each side, that ends up being 41.5. So let's go make a top that has those dimensions. We chose eastern white pine for the main box, mainly because we had it and it wasn't doing anything and taking up space. So here it is put to good use, and it was just about the perfect size for this. Now, I've also chosen pine for the top, but since we're completely out of eastern white pine, I chose southern yellow pine. And let me show you the difference between the two. You'll notice that the eastern white pine, it has a very creamy white composition to it and very little grain pattern. It's there, but it's very subtle. Whereas the southern yellow pine is very pronounced in its grain pattern. And some will say that the southern yellow pine is not as good as the eastern white pine. However, it's been used for centuries and it will do the job. And I have no doubt that it's going to do just fine. Now, I'd like to show you something about this board. You'll notice that it's pretty badly cupped right here. Okay, that's a problem. But not only is it badly cupped, but it's also badly warped in this direction. So we have compound flaws. And we can't just put this together and make a lid out of it, because that would look bad. And what causes this? Well, it's mainly my fault, because when I was taking college classes, I was so busy focusing on those that I didn't really pay attention to this board that was just sitting around doing nothing and slowly drying out. And I made no effort to try to make sure that it dried straight and flat. So that's on me. But there is a way to fix that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this board lengthwise. I'm going to rip it all the way down to the end. When I put this on the jointer is going to take off material here and here. And by the time I actually get this material removed to the point where I'm actually down into this wood here, I've taken off a big chunk of that wood. And the way to make that better is by ripping it, because once you rip it, you have less wood that needs to be removed. Let me illustrate. The first thing is when you have a piece of wood like this, to rip the wood is to make a cut lengthwise like this. That's called a rip cut. If you go the other direction, that's called a cross cut. The wood grain is like this. So you're either ripping with the grain or you're cross cutting across the grain. Now, if you have a piece of wood that's cupped, particularly like the one we have here, it's going to look something like this. And that's not very useful. So by putting this on the jointer will remove some of this. And with every pass, it removes a little bit more. The problem is, by the time you finally get down to the point where you have a flat board, you've wasted a lot of wood. And look at how thin you are at the edges. You end up with something like this. Well, that's not very useful. So the way we combat that is we take our board, let me just restore that. We take our board and we rip it down the middle. Now we have two pieces. And then when you lay that piece down, you end up with something that looks more like this. It's not as wide, but it also doesn't have quite as pronounced of a cupping going on. And so you can get by with removing a lot less material, and that maintains the thickness of the wood. And so we'll end up taking a little of that, a little of that, and probably a little of that, and we'll end up with a nice flat board. Now, once you've done that with those two boards, you can edge glue them back together and put it back in to one big wide board again. The other problem we're dealing with here is that the board has this kind of thing going on, but after laying it on the floor and looking at it, I realized that this end here, all the way down through here, and probably up to about here, is fairly flat. And so the actual curve that curves upward is actually starting right about in here, which is great news because that means when we cut this in half to get the two boards that we need, we're going to have some extra, and we can take that extra off of here and get rid of that piece there, and that makes a mostly flat board. And so looking at things like that and kind of really taking the time to think about it, sometimes you can come up with a solution and make a board that's not ideal into the ideal board for your project. We took that board outside and we cut it into the length that we need, plus a little long, because we always go long, knowing that we're going to trim some off. And then we cut the bad section off. So we were able to get most of it, but not all of it. But you can see here, there's just a little bit rocking going on here, whereas before it was like stuck way up in the air. This one here is fairly flat, but it has a lot of side rock like that. So what we're going to do next is rip these two boards right down the middle. And I don't care about being dead on accurate at this point because we'll clean that up on the machine tools. Right now we just need to get them cut down in smaller pieces that the machine tools can handle. Before I put this board through the saw, I'd like to show you something. You see how it's cupped like this? Well, if I put the board through the saw like this, it can rock back and forth as it's going through, and that's not going to give me a very stable cut. So I want to make sure that the board goes through like this so my edges are flat and they can run against the tabletop surface. That'll guarantee that the saw cut is consistent all the way down the board. You probably noticed we were struggling with that board a little bit. Let me explain what was happening there. As we were pushing the wood through, there was a lot of locked up stress inside there that was trying to get relieved. And we actually saw this when we were outside cutting. And we anticipated, knowing that we'd have trouble, we went ahead and put the riving knife back in. And this is what the riving knife is for. So as we were cutting the wood, it opened up a channel like this, and then the wood wanted to close that channel back up. The riving knife, its job is to hold that open so the saw blade doesn't bind up. Well, it was trying to bind up, and the only reason it didn't stop is because we have 240 volt power, and this thing here is unstoppable. So I ended up shutting it down, but let me show you. Right here is where we stopped cutting. But back here, you can see that the cut has actually tried to close in on itself. And so the way that I'm going to combat that is I'm going to run it back through again and take a little more material out of there. Because right now I don't care about making accurate cuts. What I care about is getting the board cut down to size. The key takeaway here is that the riving knife keeps that open. And if it hadn't done that, if that hadn't been there, it would have bound up against the blade, and then the blade would have kicked the board back like that, and that's something we don't want. So when we know we have wood that's in this condition, we want to make sure that we always have that riving knife in there. And it's really a good idea to have that there anyway, unless it gets in the way of making a cut. We ended up with 4 boards, but really we only need 3 boards to get the job done. So then it becomes a question of which boards do we want to use. So we can look at them. Well, this one's got a pretty pronounced warp this way. And this one here has what some would consider a defect. There probably was a branch at this point, and that does make for some interesting coloration, but it's also some very tough wood. And these can shrink, they can crack, they can fall out. So it really becomes a stylistic decision. We decided not to put this one in just because we don't know what's going to happen with this down the road. So we'll play it safe. We'll take this one out, and we'll use this one instead. Now you can see, there is no way that we can just glue these things together. They need a lot of work. But with the machine tools that we have in here, we can smooth these out, make them flat, perfect, square, level, and plumb, all those good things. Unfortunately, woodworking is often a compromise. So we have this board here that's nice and flat. It does have a tiny, tiny amount of bow in it, just like a hair. But this other board, on the other hand, has a lot more bow in it. You can see how much of a gap there is. There's 2 ways that we can fix this. The first way is that we can run it through the jointer over and over and over again, taking material off of the 2 ends, progressively working inward this way until we finally hit wood. But the problem is that now we've thinned up our ends. And what starts out as nice, thick, heavy boards becomes thinner and thinner. The other way to fix this is do what we did where we cut these lengthwise, except now if we make a cross cut right here, we've reduced that bow in half. And so there's a lot less material that we have to remove, but we have to do it on 2 different boards, and then we end up having to glue them back together again, which is okay. I'm really pleased at how these turned out. They went through the machine probably no more than 4 times, and that's taking off 1/16 of an inch each time. So I was able to get rid of the bows and the warps, and so the bottoms of these boards are now completely flat along with one edge. This edge here, of course, goes in the table saw. This bottom edge here goes into the planer. So, now that I got these, how do I know how much to plane? Well, I can either plane to a specific dimension that I want, or if I don't care, in this case I really don't care, I can plane it down to the same thickness as the thinnest board. What I'm going to do is run each board through, check them. If any of the boards are not cleaned up, I'll adjust it and run them all back through again. And when I'm finished, every single board will be the same thickness and be perfectly flat. All right, so you saw that that one board that I put through there was the last one that needed to be cleaned up. And after it came out, it was good. So why did I put the other 3 boards back in again, even though they were good too? Because I need every single board to be the same thickness. And so once this one cleaned up, I needed the others to also be reduced to the same thickness as the good one. So now they're all the same. Next up, the table saw. All right, the next thing we need to do is put these 2 boards back together as if they were always that way. They must become one. And then we're going to go ahead and do rabbet joints on all of these like we did all the other panels. And so they'll have an interlocking kind of thing like this. And, well, it's hard to describe with my hands, but I think you know what I'm talking about. So that is what we need to do next. Unfortunately, we are out of time, and we're going to have to let you guys go and pick this up again next week.
Thank you for watching 1834 Restoration House.